Voilà Raskovan qui a rejoint l'équipe de Christelle Desnues il y a quelques semaines. Il a développé avec Christelle des recherches en partie de paléomicrobiologie et qui aujourd'hui va nous présenter une partie au moins des travaux qu'il a fait précédemment dans le cadre notamment de son travail de thèse, et on le remercie par avance de cette présentation.
Ok, bueno, merci beaucoup. Je vais faire la présentation en anglais. Tout ça. So, as Michelle said, my name is Nicolás Raskovan. I come from Argentina. I did my PhD there, and I joined the Christelle Desnues lab August. So the title of my talk is A Journey to the Microbiomes at the End of the World, Exploring Biodiversity in Extreme Environments and Agricultural Soils. So, I did my PhD based on metagenomic studies. And during my PhD I had to do environmental sampling, set up lab procedures and set up protocols because our lab was new in the metagenomic field. That was back in 2009 when this metagenomic fever was just starting. And then I had to set up high-throughput sequencing technologies and all the bioinformatic pipelines and data analysis needed to analyze the data. And this was part of a collective and collaborative work of all our team. It was a very interesting experience. So for those that are not familiarized with the metagenomic field, when we do metagenomics using high-throughput sequencing technologies, what we do is we take an environmental sampling, we extract DNA or RNA from a microbiome in the environment, and we can do two possibilities. We can take all the DNA in the metagenomic samples, cut it in pieces, and then we will sequence that information. So we will get information from all the genomes in the microbiome, from any part of the gene. Otherwise, we can focus on a single gene or region in the genome. Typically, we use the 16S ribosomal RNA gene, and we amplify by PCR that single gene, and then we can sequence using high-throughput sequencing technologies. And the most difficult task is the bioinformatic analysis of the data. So we were interested in some of the potential of metagenomics, basically two. One was to use metagenomics to characterize and explore environments, and the second one was to use metagenomics to study, to make microbial ecology studies. When we do a characterization of an explored environment, we are using the metagenomic data for determining the microbial taxonomic composition of the sample, discover new microorganisms, analyze the metabolic potential of these microorganisms, and for doing so, we use sequence assembly, phylogenetic analysis, data mining, and most importantly, we spend a lot of time doing the biological interpretation of the data. Second, if we do a microbial ecology study, what we do is we we are interested in studying what's the microbiome variability at the environmental scale. How do microbiomes change at environmental scale? And second, we are interested in identifying which are the drivers that shape microbial communities at the environmental scale. And for doing so, we use ecological metrics, typically the alpha and beta diversity metrics, distance-based RDA, statistical analysis, and so on. So, as this talk is called Journey to the End of the World, I will invite you now to do a kind of trip to the end of the world. So we are going to leave Marseille now, and we are going to head to Argentina. And in Argentina, I studied two different kinds of environments. The Pampean region, in which we did environmental analysis, and the extreme environments at the Puna, where we did metagenomics for extreme environments. So here, this is Argentina, this is the Pampean region where we did the ecological analysis. So, and we studied soil microbiomes in the Pampean region. And then we have, in the Puna, at the north of Argentina, we have extreme environments. And we studied Laguna Diamante and Laguna Socorro. And why, to understand why it is relevant to study this extreme environment, we're going to do a journey to the past. And when I talk about why are these environments important, so when I say going to the past, I'm not saying about going to the era of the first men on Earth, not even when the first dinosaurs were on Earth, not even when the animals were still on Earth. But even before that, we have to go to the past billions of years ago, when in the Earth was only bacteria and archaea. There were no animals, there were no plants, only bacteria and archaea. It was an environment full of high volcanic activity. There was the anaerobic atmosphere, there was no oxygen on Earth. There was a high concentration of heavy metals. And the unicellular organisms were forming multicellular layer structures called stromatolites. They were using autotrophic, basically they were using inorganic compounds as energy sources like arsenide, nitrate, ammonium, hydrogen. They were using carbon dioxide as the main carbon source. They were doing anaerobic respiration because there was no oxygen to breathe. And they were using nitrate, sulfate, arsenate, selenate as terminal electron acceptors. And they started to differentiate. And this differentiation led to a metabolic diversification of life on Earth. But they were restricted to some environments with the right conditions to grow, until the first photosynthetic organisms appeared on Earth. And these photosynthetic organisms were the ones generating the oxygen that we now are breathing. And thanks to this, all the organisms and the life on Earth could spread around the whole surface of our planet. And these stromatolites were dominating our planet from over 2.5 billion years. But now, we can still find some stromatolites in certain areas of our planet. And they are in very remote places. Actually, Christelle did some work in stromatolites, modern stromatolites. So by studying these stromatolites, we can learn a lot about the life in the past. So in 2009, 2008, the group of Maria Eugenia Farias in Argentina, they discovered at the Puna, at 3,000 meters above sea level, the first stromatolites that were found at such altitude. The second important thing is that the conditions in this area are in many aspects, are very similar to that conditions that were prevailing on Earth 2 billion years ago. So we were basically trying to use metagenomics to understand better how were these stromatolites composed. And what were the questions that we wanted to address? Well, first, what are the organisms that constitute Stockholm stromatolites? Second, to know which are the metabolic functions of these stromatolites, and how is the internal organization within the stromatolites. So we use 16S amplicon sequencing, and the first important thing that we found is that there is a high taxonomic diversity within the stromatolites. They are members from different phyla, several different phyla, and there is a high diversity. When we did a rarefaction curve in which you see how many species you observe when you increase the number of sequences, we didn't reach an asymptote. That means that with 100,000 sequences, we couldn't find all the taxonomic diversity within the stromatolites. But the most important result, I think the most interesting result, is that 33% of the sequences could not be classified even at the field level, meaning that the stromatolite would be home from organisms that we don't know anything at all about them. From this 33%, there was 13% that showed less than 80% similarity to the best hit in NCBI database. When we did a phylogenetic analysis of these sequences, we found that most of the sequences were clustering apart from all of them, all the rest of them. And these sequences could not be classified even at the phenol level, meaning that in the stromatolite they are members that are probably new phyla. This is very interesting. because we don't know anything about these organisms. When we did an analysis of, since the stromatolites are layered structures, we did a 16S amplicon sequencing of different layers within the stromatolite, and we found that there is a very, very specific organization within the stromatolite. In the first layer, you have mostly the Deinococcus thermus. This is a bacteria that is very, very resistant to radiation. So, since at 4,000 meters above sea level, there is a high UV radiation, these Deinococcus thermus are protecting the whole stromatolites from the radiation. Right below the Deinococcus thermus, we have the cyanobacteria, which are the photosynthetic organisms that are generating the food for the stromatolite. And in the lower layers, we start having a lot of bacteria that use anaerobic metabolisms from sulfur. So basically, we found that there is a very specific organization within the stromatolites, and most interestingly, these distal lineages that I talked before, they were all in the last layers, in the very inner layers. So in an environment that is completely anaerobic and probably with the sulfur metabolism. So this is quite interesting. So basically what we learned from the Zooxanthellae stromatolites, that they harbor a highly diverse microbial diversity. They are stratified to different organisms playing different roles at each layer, and they are a rich source for completely unknown microbes. Then I will invite you to go to another extreme environment very near Zooxanthellae, that is called Diamante Lake. And Diamante Lake is a very, very interesting environment because Diamante Lake has highly extreme environmental conditions, even more extreme than in Laguna Diamante. And I will show you more or less how does it look like, this environment. So it's an environment that is at 4,000 meters above sea level, higher than the other one. It's exposed to high UV radiation. There is a night temperature variation of up to 40 degrees. There is low oxygen, and there is almost no life here. In the lake, there are extreme physicochemical conditions. We have high salinity. We have extremely high arsenic concentration, 12,000 times over what we can resist. High pH, 11. There is and here they found a very rare formation attached to rocks. They look like biofilms, but they didn't know anything about these organisms, nothing. So they took samples from these biofilms, not like this is just a representation. They were more carefully taken, and they were taken to the lab, and we basically wanted to know, using metagenomic analysis, what kind of organisms were forming part of these Diamante Lake red biofilms, and what were the strategies that they used to deal with such a high arsenic concentration. So the first thing that we did was electron microscopy, and we found that there is some kind of biofilm forming in these rocks. And when we did the metagenomic analysis, we found, and that was very surprising, that most of the organisms in the biofilms were archaea. And not any archaea, but they were allophilic archaea. All of them were alloarchaea. We had archaea that are resistant to a very high salinity. And only 6% of the organisms in the biofilms were bacteria. Within the bacteria, most of the bacteria were anaerobic. That means that the biofilm is developing under probably very limiting oxygen conditions. And when we did the same rarefaction curves that I showed before, we saw that we could reach an asymptote, meaning that we really, with our sequencing efforts, we could more or less describe the whole diversity within the stromatolite, the biofilm. So the arsenic metabolisms. Arsenic is a toxic compound for most of life on Earth. Most of life, in presence of arsenic, they die. But there are some microorganisms that can resist the arsenic concentration. Most of these microorganisms, they use detoxification processes using the ARS operon, in which basically what they are doing is expelling the arsenic from cells, But there are some few other organisms that can use arsenic as a source of energy. So for this, they use basically two enzymes. First, they can get energy from arsenic using arsenic oxidases, and they can do anaerobic respiration of arsenic using arsenic reductases. So remember these two enzymes, arsenic oxidases to get energy from arsenic, arsenic reductases to do anaerobic respiration. These are important because I will keep talking about these enzymes. So this arsenic oxidase, the one used for energy yield, they can be proposed as bioenergetic ancient enzymes by a group here in Marseille. And the reason why they propose this is because arsenic oxidases are found in both bacteria and archaea, and the phylogenetic root of these enzymes seems to be somewhere in the common ancestor between archaea and bacteria, called the last universal common ancestor. So they have proposed that these enzymes emerge in the last universal common ancestor, and they spread to archaea bacteria. But they have never been tested experimentally in archaea. So they don't know if these enzymes are functional or not. In the biofilm, using metagenomic information, we found that not only in the archaea there were the enzymes used for detoxification of arsenic, but also there was a high abundance of arsenic oxidases and arsenic reductases, the enzymes used for bioenergetic use of arsenic. And this was the first time that these enzymes, bioenergetic enzymes, were found in archaea. So this is the first evidence that archaea can use arsenic as a source of energy. We did a phylogenetic analysis of these enzymes, and we found that the archaea arsenic oxidases are not only monophyletic, but also they are in the root of the phylogenetic tree, meaning that the archaea arsenic oxidases could have a very ancient origin. Second, we tested that they are functionally functional. We saw that this anaerobium isolate from the Diamante Lake was able to oxidize arsenic, and also when we grow the anaerobium in presence of arsenic, we found that they were growing better in the presence of arsenic than in the control, meaning that they can probably be using the arsenic as a source of energy. We also did a phylogenetic analysis of the arsenic reductases, and we found that they were monophyletic as well, so they could be here in the archaea since a long time. But since it's the only kind of archaea that have these enzymes, we think that they were obtained by horizontal gene transfer from bacteria. So the remaining question that we have to answer is, can this archaea grow anaerobically in arsenic? We don't know that yet. So what do we learn from this? We found that the first biofilms dominated by archaea in natural environments. We found that archaea can use arsenic in bioenergetic processes, and we found that there were some enzymes used to gain energy from arsenic. That the enzymes used to gain energy from arsenic are ancient. So I talked before that we were interested in characterizing and exploring environments using metagenomics. I already showed you that. And also in doing microbial ecology studies. So I will now talk a little bit about what we did in microbial ecology studies. So if someone got lost in the previous part, you can come back now because I will change the topic. So this is what I told you. We were interested in studying the microbiome variability at the environmental scale and to identify which are the drivers that shapes microbial communities. So we are now going to continue our journey, and this time we are going to the Pampean region in Argentina, a region with a high production of agricultural production, and the environment that we are going to study is the soil. And soil is the most diverse environment in the world. They think that estimations indicate that there are more cells in soil than stars in the universe. So soil is also a highly unknown universe. 99% of the organisms in the soil are still unknown. Nobody knows who they are and what are they doing. Now we know a little bit more about who they are, but we don't know anything about what are they doing. And they establish a very highly complex interactions. There are some interactions, I will show you now, are high complex microbial interactions. There are some that are symbiotic, there are some that are competitive. And soil microorganisms play an essential role in plant growth. They contribute with most of the soil nutrients. They favor plant growth by symbiotic associations. And on the other hand, we don't know a lot about what are these microorganisms doing in the soil. So when I started my PhD, so as I said before, the soil microorganisms are really playing a major role in soil ecology and plant growth. So when I started my PhD, there was only one single report of soil microbial metagenomics. But since during my PhD there was a lot of papers published talking about what are the soil microorganisms doing in the soil. And from this work, what we learned was that microbial communities are highly rich and highly diverse, that they are mainly composed by actinobacteria, acidobacteria, bacteroidetes, beta and alpha proteobacteria, firmicutes, verrucomicrobia, and Bractomycetes. These are the main organisms in the soil. We also learned that land use and management can affect microbial communities. Rotation, tillage systems, and practices, fertilization regimes, they all affect microbial communities. And also, there were some works doing a detailed characterization of rhizosphere in the rhizosphere microbiome. And they found that there are strong differences between the epiphytic and rhizosphere soil, and they change according to phenotype and plant growth. But these works were all done in the lab. They were not done in the field. So we know a little bit of what are these microbial communities in a cytotron in a lab, but we don't know how are they actually composed in the environment. And why we were interested in studying soil microbiology in Argentina? First, because we have 50 million hectares under agriculture. This is much more than the surface of France complete. We have an identification of agricultural practices, and we have, in the last few years we lost 23 million tons of nutrients in the Pampean regions only between 1970 and 2000. There was a net loss of inorganic matter and soil fertility. There was an intensification of the use of agrochemicals, and there was a trend towards the use of monoculturing of soil. So what were the goals and questions that we wanted to do in this work? We wanted to generate a soil metagenomic reference dataset of the Argentinian Pampas, and we wanted to determine which were the main variables that were shaping the microbial communities in Pampean soils. So in order to do so, we formed a consortium of 11 research groups, and we took samples all across the Pampean region. In total, we took 128 soil samples from animal sequences, 36 soil samples for shotgun sequencing. We took some samples from bulk and rhizophoric soil. We analyzed cDNA and cDNA, so metagenomics and metatranscriptomics. We did agronomic and non-agronomical soils, and we compared different tillage systems, conventional tillage and no-till farming. So we formed this Pampa dataset that were made by 20 full runs of 4x4, more than 80 million reads and more than 7 billion base pairs. That this is equivalent to almost 2,000 bacterial genomes, which now doesn't mean like a lot because with Illumina we have overcome this by far, but at this time in 2010, this was a lot. What we found that the main barriers that were modulating soil microbial communities were first, soil humidity. Samples were separating between the humid region, the semi-humid region, and the semi-arid region. Second, we found that soil microbial communities were different, highly different between the rhizospheric and the bulk soil. We found here are the bulk soil and here are the rhizospheric soil. Each dot is a different sample. And the third variable was the agronomical management. Within each of these groups, samples were separating between agronomic samples and non-agronomic samples. So this work brought the attention of different companies. One of these was Rizobacter. Rizobacter is a company in Argentina that they produce bioinoculants. So they produce microorganisms to put in contact to the plants and favor the plant growth. And the goal of this joint venture that was done between the institute where I did the PhD and this company was to generate an integrated product in which you not only will sell germplasms and specific traits for plant crops like wheat or soybean, but also some chemicals and biomolecules to favor plant growth and some specific microorganisms that can favor these particular crops. So it's trying to sell a whole package. So, and in this initiative, I contributed in the microorganism analysis. So what we did was we took samples from 11 locations, more or less 180 samples from soybean and wheat. We analyzed the rhizospheric and endophytic communities. We did a massive isolation also of bacteria, more than 2,000 isolates from these plants. And the idea is in the future to test in the field some of these isolates just to see whether they can improve plant crop production in the field. From the analysis, the metagenomic analysis, we are now preparing a publication that will be submitted. So this is the map of where the samples are taken. There are 11 locations all around the mountain region. We took samples from 2 different crops, the main crops in Argentina, soybean and wheat. And we took samples not only from the rhizospheric soil, which is the soil that is highly attached to the roots, but also from the endophytic communities that are the organisms that are within the roots or highly attached to the roots. And the important question that we wanted to address with this sampling was, what are the differences between the soil rhizospheric and endophytic communities at field conditions? And second question was, how are the cultural microorganisms represented in the natural microbiomes? So the first thing we learned is that the soil rhizospheric microbiomes are more diverse than endophytic microbiomes. This is expected, but we saw that there is almost more than 1 order of magnitude difference in the richness. That means the number of species that can be found in one and other compartment. And this was observed not in both, in soybean and wheat. The second thing we learned is we took all the samples, all the microbial communities in all the samples, we compared them all against all for each of these 4 groups of samples, so wheat rhizospheric soil, soybean rhizospheric soil, wheat endophytes, and soybean endophytes. We compared them all against all, and we found that, and these are the distances, so you have sample 1, sample 2, and this is the difference, the measurement of the difference between one microbiome and another microbiome. We plot all the differences that we found from all the samples against all the samples, and we found that the wheat endophytic communities were highly diverse, were very, very diverse between different regions. That means that at the environmental scale, wheat the organisms that attach to and interact with the wheat are highly variable. On the other hand, the endophytic communities in soybean were not highly diverse. They were basically pretty much similar across the environmental scale. And the rhizospheric soil were all both very similar. When we used this information to do a taxonomic characterization, a deep characterization of all the organisms that we found by both techniques, 16S amplicon sequencing and culturing. And one of the most interesting results was that almost 40%, or between 30 and 40% of the organisms that we could isolate were not found in the 16 amplicon sequencing, meaning that both techniques are actually showing different universes from the same sample. But it was interesting that we could isolate a lot of different genera from soil. We have 48 genera that were isolated from soil for soybean, and 29 different genera that were isolated from soil in wheat. So what are the take-home messages from the soil microbiome analysis? First, that the main variables that affect soil microbiomes are precipitations, bulk, rhizospheric bulk, and rhizospheric compartments, the agronomical treatment, and the management is the less affected, the variable that less affect soil microbiomes. Then we learned that the endophytic communities have a much lower richness and diversity than the rhizospheric soil in wheat and soybean. We find that the endophytic communities are highly variable for the same type of crop, and this was found mostly in wheat. And we have now a much better understanding of which are the cultural microorganisms that are commonly found as deciduous crops at field conditions. So in order to develop new bioinoculants, we have now a much better understanding of which are the organisms that are actually present in the field conditions in wheat and soybean. So we have to choose organisms from that to develop new bioinoculants. So all this work was done in the Institute INDEAR in Argentina, in which this group is the group leader is Martín Vázquez, that was my PhD supervisor. We were 3 PhD students doing this work, and we were also a sequencing facility, the only sequencing facility in Argentina. And it was operated by Soledad Romero, Benja Luna, and Lara. They were giving sequencing services to all the scientific community in Argentina. And there were 2 bioinformaticians, Santiago Reval and Mónica Fabra. All the work done in the extreme environments was done in collaboration with a group of María Eugenia Farias. That is a group that has been studying these environments for quite a long time. So now, we have to come back to Marseille, and I will dedicate some minutes to talk about what I'm going to do here in Cristel de New Labs. So, what about the postdoc project? So, now we will need to make another trip. We cannot stay in Marseille, we have to go now to the Siberia. Why to the Siberia? Let's start the video. Okay. We need to go now to the Siberia, to the islands. Let me see a name because I don't remember. Novosibirsk Islands. Why to these islands? Because these islands used to be the home for the woolly mammoths. These animals lived in the Siberian steppes and grasslands around 10,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago. At this time, the environment was quite different there. There was a grassland. Actually, the environment was called the mammoth grasslands. And last year, in these islands, very far away, a group composed by Russian and Korean team did an expedition in May 2013, and they found the Malivirakovsky mammoth. And this mammoth is a highly unique specimen. Why? because it's the best conserved mammoth specimen today. It's that well conserved that you can even see the flesh and the muscles very well conserved. They still have the red coloration, and they even claim that they were able to find blood in these samples. So this specimen corresponded to an old female of 47-year-old. It was more or less 2.5 meters high. And we were wondering about this specimen. How was the gut microbiome of these mammoths, or all the mammoths constituted? So why we are asking this question? First, because there is only very few fresh samples were found from mammoths, so it's very hard to know which are the microorganisms that were interacting with the mammoth if they were not specimens that were conserved. Second, because the only description of the diet of the mammoth was done based on microscopic description of this diet. They found some plant remains in the intestinal content, and they deduced what was the alimentation of the mammoth based on this characterization. Almost nothing is known about the bacterial species associated with mammoth. Only very few reports were talking about which were the bacteria associated with mammoths. And most importantly, there is no single report on what was the viruses that were associated to mammoths. So we are very lucky because we got extraordinary samples for asking for answering our question. We got several replicates of mammoth intestines. We have 6 different samples from the intestine of the mammoth. We have also control from environmental contamination. If we are going to analyze something that was that died 40,000 years ago, we need to know which are the bacteria that were present in the environment, and for this we have 3 controls: the gingival muscle, the pericardium, and the surrounding soil. So whatever we found here, we can assume that it's not. Whatever thing we find in the intestines and these samples, we can assume that are contamination. And also we have 6 modern elephant feces to compare to modern microbiota to see what are the differences and similarities to modern gut microbiome community. And for this I would like to thank Oleg Medianikov, Artemy Goncharov, Alexei Tikhonov, and Semyon Grigoriev, which were the persons that facilitated the samples and made this work possible. So how are we going to deal with these samples? So we first planned a first strategy in which from one single mammoth intestine we are going to do transmission electron microscopy using resin inclusion and trying to analyze viruses from the sample. We are going to prepare viruses. We are going to purify viruses from the sample, and we are going to do this by different step purification. From this purification, we are going to get the RNA fraction and the DNA fraction from the viruses purified, and we are going to do high-throughput sequencing of the RNA and DNA fraction from the viruses. And from this also multi-step virus purification, and from the whole mammoth intestine sample, we are going to do metaproteomics. We are also going to test 3 different protocols to prepare total DNA from this sample, and we are going to do metagenomic DNA extraction. And from this metagenomic DNA, we are going to do 16S amplicon sequencing and shotgun sequencing, and again, high-throughput sequencing of that. We are going to test where we can find giant viruses in the samples, and also try to make bacterial isolation from these samples. And if we get something interesting here, we might also do a genome sequencing using high-throughput sequencing analysis. And for this, I would like to give a special thanks to the group of Didier Raoul, Bernard Lascola, Eric Chabrier, and Isabel Bernier that they kindly wanted to participate of this project, helping different steps of this pipeline. And once we get results from this first strategy, we are going to head into a new second step in which we are going to do an extensive characterization and validation of results. How? So first, according to which are the interesting results that we get, we are going to choose the direction to follow based on the results. We are going to see from all the techniques that we did which are the interesting ones, and we are going to analyze. We are going to validate the results using the analysis for different replicates. We have 6 different replicates to validate the results. We are going to discard the environmental contaminations by analyzing the surrounding soils and the mussels. And we are going to give a context to this information comparing to modern microbiomes. So I already finished the talk. I would like to give a special thanks to Cristel Deneuve, Sonia, Sara, and Priscilla, which since I arrived were very, very kind with me and very helpful. So I really want to thank them for all their help. And all the colleagues under me that honestly, since I arrived, they have been really, really kind with me. So I'm very happy to be here. And thanks for listening to it.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Je pense que c'est la première fois qu'on voyage autant dans un séminaire. Merci. Questions?
Investigation you did there. Did you, or did you not, it was not apparent from your presentation, find any rhizobia species in there? Because you would expect them to be more abundant with the soybean soil rather than with the wheat soil. For your colleagues who are medical students here, they should know that soybean is a legume and require association with rhizobium for nitrogen fixation.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we were also expecting, so just to put in context, what he said is that soybean, they are very known to have a very close interaction with rhizobium, such as Bradyrhizobium or species like this, so we were expecting to have a high abundance of this, and of course we found them, but they are not as high as we were expecting. The problem is that most of the other organisms are not culturable. So until now, well, the way we were studying the rhizospheric organisms was by culturing and then doing the 16S characterization. What we found by using metagenomic analysis was that yes, they are present, but they are not the most abundant. There are many other organisms present that are higher abundance. But yes, they are present.
So the plant that is grown is not a driver.
Sorry?
The plant, a particular crop that you're growing is not a driver for the microbial population. Is this what you said?
Well, microbiomes change with the plants. So it's kind of both. But let's say, so basically our feeling from this is that microbiomes change due to the environmental conditions. So you change the soil humidity, the microbiome change. You change the temperature, the microbiome change. So from the pool that you have a different environment, the plant selects some. And the environment, the organisms that the plant selects, in the case of soybean, is quite similar across environmental scale. In the case of wheat, it's completely random. Not random, yes, but highly different. Yeah.
In relation to the first lake that you analyzed, you found about 30% totally unidentified
Yes.
microbes. And this was all 16S analysis.
Yes.
In GenBank, about 50% of all 16S are unidentified. Basically, it's more.
Yeah.
Do you
So I did both. The first thing I did was to compare to the ones that actually known. Okay, the ones that you know exactly the taxonomic classification. And then I found that there were, high abundance of organisms, like 33% that could not be classified at all at the film level. But then, yes, I wondered, well, there are many other organisms in databases from which we don't know anything about. So we know that someone find these organisms. He doesn't know what's the taxonomic classification, but we know that it was found, for instance, in Asia. So we did also a blast classification of all the sequences against NCBI, just to see if there was someone finding the same organism, regardless of the taxonomic composition. And we found that 13% of the sequences were not even found, even at the uncultural, even in the non-classified sequences. So that means that not only we don't know the taxonomic classification, but it was not even found in any other environment. So, yeah.
Could I go for another one?
Yeah, sure.
Whether for the soil, for the lakes, or for the mammoth, we seem to ignore that they are eukaryotes, and it's especially important for
Yes.
a mammoth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is a large eukaryotic fungal and aerobic population that is participating to the food digestion. How do you reconcile it with
Yeah, so I did, for the case of the soil and extreme environments, so in the case in which we only use 16S amplicon sequencing, we know that we are losing part of the information that comes from the eukaryotic fraction, but since 16S is only for prokaryotes, you cannot see the eukaryotes. In the case of the soil, I didn't show, but with the shotgun sequencing, since you have information from any organisms in your samples, we did separate the eukaryotic sequences from the prokaryotic sequences, and we analyzed the fungal composition of these samples. I didn't show the results. Yes, so we have, basically we have a catalog of all the eukaryotic organisms found in soil. Still, the taxonomic classification of these organisms is highly complex because many of them were not sequenced yet. So you have lots of unknown fungi or things like that. In the case of the extreme environment in which we did shotgun sequences, there was not single eukaryote, but this is expectable due to the environmental conditions. And in the case of mammoth, we are going to do shotgun sequencing with the idea of finding, because for instance, I didn't talk here about the viruses. And it's because with the sequencing depth that we used, we didn't find any viruses. But in the mammoth, we expect to have a good description of all the domains of life, viruses, eukaryotics, bacteria, and everything. But we are going to do that using shotgun sequences. 16S will be all, unfortunately, will be only focused on prokaryotes.
Yeah, one more. You should actually was very important by me for the soil flora. So it is a stupid question. Do we know about the flora in the rain?
Yes, there are some works.
Okay.
They did
in
the
the pampas.
But it's more likely that you will have a spread of bacteria by the wind than by the rain. So yes, you have wind and you have microbiomes moving around at the environmental scale. So, rain and wind and yes, there are bacteria moving around. There are no works on that in Argentina, but there are some works from other groups in the US in which they did the air microbiome. So yes, you can have a measurement of how are they spreading. But yeah, for sure, they are organisms spreading at the environmental scale by the wind and the...
You want to
Yeah. Yeah, but you have also animals moving. There are many, many ways that microorganisms can use to spread.
Question sur ces beaux voyages, différents points du monde, différentes échelles. Non, mais merci beaucoup encore pour cette très belle présentation. Merci.
Okay.